Good evening. It's time to start another series of studies, and this one is going to be on the house of Joseph. I usually get this posted earlier, but it's late on a Saturday night when I'm recording this. I have been out of town for a couple of days. You know, all the bad weather has been coming in, that big winter storm across the whole southeast. Anyway, I was supposed to speak at St. Simon's Island it was a pastor's wives retreat. It was such a good time. I didn't know from the beginning, after the storm was coming in, could I get there? If I got there, could I get back flying into, I had a layover going and coming in Atlanta to try to get back. So anyway, this day has been crazy. I've been running through the airport like I'm on the Hertz commercial or whatever that was used to, where, somebody's running through the airport. This morning, before I ever got to the airport, there where I was at St. Simon's, I had to go to the Brunswick airport. But my flight had changed 6 times before I ever got to the airport. Anyway, crazy day. And it's good to be home, and it's good to be starting this lesson, and I thank you for joining. We have just gotten started. You haven't missed anything. This is the first lesson. It's the story of Joseph, beloved, despised, and exalted. And a lot of the notes from this series will come from F.B. Meyer's book by that title. So anyway, I think you'll enjoy it. It's one of the best studies I've ever done for myself personally, and I've taught it one time before, and I wanted to share it this spring. It'll be our spring study. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. So most of us know the character of Joseph. He's a pretty well-known character in the Old Testament, but I think there are so many wonderful truths that are found there that are just overlooked. Do you remember that Rachel had wanted a child, begged for a child, even had a bad attitude of not having one for a while with her husband? Give me a child or else I die, and Jacob at his wit's end, just there's nothing he could do. He couldn't make it happen if the Lord did not bless them with a child. But whenever he finally did, and we'll kind of get into the story of that as we go, whenever the Lord did bless Rachel, she gave birth to Joseph, and later on Benjamin. We'll mention him too. But this is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. So many thoughts there, but it's kind of nice to review it. F.B. Meyer says in his book, he said, whenever Joseph arrived on the scene, the family dynamics, you might remember Laban, Leah and Rachel. Remember, Jacob was tricked on his wedding night, and he didn't get the girl he thought he was getting. He got her sister. Can you even imagine that? All of the drama from the very beginning. But F.B. Meyer says that whenever Joseph was born, it was like a fair Saxon child amid the swarthy natives of a tent of gypsies who've made it their prize now. So from the very beginning, it was going to be an exciting life for sure. And we're going to kind of take that apart and study it during this semester that we study. But just to kind of refresh your memory, when he was yet a child, he was hastily caught up by his mother and sustained in her arms on the back of a swift camel, urged to its highest speed in the flight across the desert. So from the beginning, things are moving in the life of Joseph. Even as a child, he could just remember the panic that spread through the camp when tidings came that Esau, the dreaded uncle, was on his march and had 400 followers coming in with him. The last anything had happened, Jacob and Esau were not on good terms. And then there was the morning that his father limped into the camp, maimed in body, but with the look of a prince on his face from where he had wrestled with the angel. And this is just kind of background. He's still a child when all of this is happening. And let me ask you, do you remember things from when you were a child? I think a lot of people do. They say, whoever they are, that beginning around age 4, we start remembering things long term. Some people say they can remember a few things that happened when they were 3, but you don't hear that very often, I think. But then more recently still, besides all of that I just mentioned, he could recall the hurried flight from the enraged idolaters of Shechem. In Genesis 34 is where that story is. So we kind of start this story leading into Joseph's life around Genesis 31. So the thing with Shechem is around Genesis 34. And then in chapter 35, it's maybe at Bethel, where his father had probably shown him the very spot on which the foot of that mystic ladder had rested, and where the whole family formally entered into a covenant with God, a new covenant with God. So that happened around Genesis 35. And I want to quote this from the book by F.B. Meyer. Maybe this was the turning point of Joseph's life. Such events make deep impressions on young hearts. The other sons of Jacob may have been unmoved spectators, but there was a different response in the heart of Joseph, no doubt, even as a child. Maybe he felt, this God shall be my God, just like his dad. He was his dad's God. Maybe he decided for himself personally that was going to be his God too. But some things we get so familiar with, like the story of Joseph, but some things even in our lives, we get so familiar with them that some of the details, some of the beauty of things, familiarity of things, it goes unnoticed because we're just used to them. I tell ladies, whenever you have company coming over, the thing you should do first is dust the picture frames, because you've been looking at them. You've been looking at them. You don't even pay any attention to them anymore. But when somebody comes to your house that's never seen them, the first thing they do is pick up the picture frame, and then there's a layer of dust on top, because you haven't really paid any attention to them lately. So I think that's kind of how some of these stories are. It's true in everything in our lives if you think back over it. I remember one time being at a church family's house, and when we walked in, Dave saw a couch there, and he said, "This couch looks so familiar." I said, "It's in our house." One like it. It was in our house, but it wasn't a room that we sat in all the time. We just passed by it. And so he said, this couch looks familiar. Yeah, we have one of those, So it's kind of like that My Fair Lady, musical. I've grown accustomed to your face. Yeah, you just get used to looking at things, and you kind of take it for granted, don't really pay any attention to the details anymore. But bringing it back around to what we're talking about here, this is a statement, and I think it does us well to consider it. When a truth is fighting for existence, it compels us, whether we love it or not, to consider it. I'm going to say that one more time. When a truth is fighting for existence, it compels us, whether we love it or not, to consider it. But when its position is secured, it becomes so well used or mentioned that it goes unnoticed and unvalued. And the thing that came to my mind about that, there was a time when nobody knew that the earth was round. They thought it was flat. Like, the mental picture I have of that when I think of it, like a flat earth, like you could just drop off the side of it. That's what people used to think before they decided that the earth is round. They discovered that. Of course, to me, even alarming still is that how is it round and we're not falling off the earth? It's that gravity that, given to us by the Lord, that we stay attached to planet Earth that we're walking on. We don't even think about it being round. It doesn't seem round when we're walking on it every day. And so anyway, it's truths. Once they're talked about and tried to be proven or whatever, or try to be told, it compels us to pay attention to it. And that's kind of how some of the Old Testament stories are, even some of the New Testament stories, the Proverbs, things like that. We just get so familiar with them that we don't think about them. So we're going to try to remedy that in this study of Joseph. We think we know all about these things, and they will always be first and foremost, and yet there are depths of meaning and beauty that escape us by their very familiarity. So true. So I'm going to give you kind of a points outline kind of thing to help us carry us through the story of Joseph. And I'm going to start with point number 1, the formative influences of Joseph's early life. And by formative, I mean just what was it that shaped him to the person that he was in your own life. Think about this. We have all been shaped by 3 things: by our circumstances, we were just talking about Joseph's, by our influences, by our experiences. All of those things have played into the person that we are. So 17 years before our story opens, a little boy, because we're going to pick up a little bit later on in his life than the things I was just talking about. So 17 years before our story opens, a little boy was born to Rachel, the favorite wife of Jacob. So even saying that much, there's going to be a little bit of drama, And Jacob was then living as a manager for his uncle Laban. Over in Genesis 27 is where that story started. And just for a setting as to where that would be, There was like a fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We've heard about those. We find them all the way back in the beginning of the Bible. But that's where his grandfather, Abraham, had been called by God. And it's interesting if you look at a map down now, and I would encourage you to do that. I handed one out in class. I don't think we could see it if I even held it up now. Abraham's journey. We'll try Abraham's journey. But if you just look up a map of that, you'll find Haran, which is a location that we're talking about right there in that crescent valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But you can actually see from Ur of the Chaldees that you hear mentioned in this story here and there, how the path would have gone to go up to Haran, down into Canaan, over into Egypt. And in addition to that, you can see above that to the north, Mount Ararat, where the ark rested. You'll see Mount Sinai, the Nile River, where Moses was floated down the river, remember? You'll see the Red Sea, the crossing there where they crossed. Nineveh shows on here. Babylon shows on here. So interesting. So just a map of Abraham's journey, but this is the same area where we find the story of Joseph. But Joseph's life was influenced by 3 deaths while he was still fairly young. When they reached the family settlement, the old nurse Deborah was dying, and she was the last link to those bright days when her young mistress Rebecca came across the desert to be Isaac's bride. So Deborah died, and then the next death happened as they moved slowly up the narrow ridge overlooking Bethlehem. Suddenly a halt was called, and Rachel, his mother, Joseph's mother, could not go another step. She was expecting, and she was in hard labor. And she died there, and she left behind a little brother for Joseph, and that would be Benjamin, the last 2 sons to Jacob. And then a short while later, Joseph stood beside his dad as they buried his grandfather Isaac beside Rebekah, and it would be the same place that 27 years later Joseph would return to bury his father Jacob. Anyway, so many things have happened in Joseph's young life, and all of this had happened before he was no older than 17. So he'd gone from a child to a teenager, and so much drama and experience and tragedy and all of those things. And just as those things shape us, they no doubt shaped Joseph. But God had big plans for Joseph's life. Those were just the formative influences that made him who he was. But number 2, the experiences of his home life. Joseph, we know, was endowed with remarkable intelligence. It's been said that children's intelligence comes from their heredity and their environment. One or the other, and probably both, shape who they are. And that was true of Joseph's life. It would almost seem that he were chief over the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Do you remember they were the servants of Rachel and Leah? But these were all born before he was born. Remember, the mothers would give their handmaids, also to bear children. And so he very possibly, even at a fairly young age, was over them. And Joseph was smart. He was intelligent. He could interpret dreams. We know that. It was a gift from God. God had plans for him. Somebody asked me at this retreat that I was on this weekend, spoke 4 times, but one of them was a question and answer, and they turned in questions the night before for me to do that in the next session, and they were such good. We had such good conversation about that. But one of them was about, does God speak to people through dreams? And I said, well, he definitely did in the Old Testament. However, we have the full revelation. That's not the way God speaks to us now. We have the revelation of everything he wants us to know. But in Joseph's days, yes, he had dreams that God gave him, and he interpreted those. That's what got him in trouble. We'll see. So he was wise. Later on in Egypt, he's going to be smart enough to run the country. So we see his intelligence that's going to lead to that. He didn't just wake up one day and all of a sudden he's intelligent. It's been coming there all along. He had knowledge, we would say, beyond his years. Wiser and smarter and in some ways more mature, for his age than most young men. And that combined with his tender heart. And you might say, how do you get that Joseph had a tender heart? Because he was tattling on his brothers, you remember. And thoughts there, like most of us have siblings, and we can kind of see that playing out, how it would play out in our own families. But you'll see his tender heart as we go through this. Remember later on in his dealings with his brothers, when everything is revealed, he wept loudly and things like that. And obviously had the love of his dad. And maybe it was just Jacob's love for Rachel, and being one of the last sons born. For whatever reason, he gained favor with his dad. And that's what's going to cause a lot of conflict with Joseph and his brothers. But in chapter 37, I'm going to pick up there. Genesis 37, I think I'll start at verse 1 and read down to verse 3. And Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, that's what I was just mentioning, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah. We talked about his father's wives, and Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. So here he is, one of the younger ones. He's going to go and tell on his brothers. Verse 3, now Israel, that's Jacob. Remember, Jacob was renamed Israel. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. So, because Jacob favored him, he's going to give him a coat that's different than what all the other brothers have. And so this coat of many colors caused a conflict for this reason. When we think a coat of many colors, probably the first thing that comes to our mind is like a coat with of patchwork, just pieces of different colors of fabric. But then, the question that begs to be answered, why would all of his brothers want that coat? Like, what men are walking around looking for a patchwork coat, right? But in Bible days, the Hebrew word just simply means a tunic. It probably reached down his arms. It was a little bit longer, and probably maybe a lighter color, like a white or a light color like that, with dark strips around the bottom and maybe around the sleeves that hung down to the wrist. And the significance of this was this. His brothers were out working in the fields. They would not have been wearing something longer or white, because for the jobs that they had to do, they had to move more easily. White would show stains. They had to wade through swamps. They had to carry sheep over their shoulders, climb hills, all of the things, fight off beasts, maybe walk through creeks and all kinds of things. And so those flowing robes would have been hard to handle, and they would have stained very easily. So the fact that Joseph was given a lighter color robe with some color to it, but mostly a lighter color, it was just showing favor to Joseph, and he wasn't going to have to work the same way that his brothers did. But then the case was aggravated a little bit because of his plain speaking. Joseph was plain spoken. It says in verse 2 that we just read, Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. This may not seem kind, I guess, but maybe he felt like open rebuke is better than secret love, as we know in the Bible. How would that have gone over with your siblings if they had gone to your dad and told on you? I have 4 siblings, one's in heaven, 3 still here. And even to this day, we're adults. I don't want them telling on me for anything. So how much more so when we're kids, for sure. Sometimes it's the truest kindness, though, after due and repeated warnings, to expose somebody's evil for their own sake. I would say for the family's sake. I'll mention that in just a second. But before that, people that God intends for specific use, calls for specific use, he tends to keep them on a short leash. They maybe see things very clearly that others do not, and he draws them to him. He doesn't let them get very far before he pulls them back. Just as God gives us, he gives us choices for salvation and for service. Remember, he said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And anybody who opens the door. For salvation, you can ask the Lord to come in. Or if you just want him in for fellowship and he's going to use you for service, your choice. You make that choice. But he keeps you on a short leash if he's specifically got something in mind that he wants you to do. I grew up in a preacher's family, as most of you know. And the Lord kept me on a short leash. Even in my teen years, I kind of felt like the Lord probably might have me marry a preacher. I always loved preachers, had a heart for them. So that was in the back of my mind. I could not get away with anything. Not that I tried to get away with terrible, terrible things, but you might remember that I told you the story of one night being in a neighborhood where I wasn't supposed to be, the back side of the neighborhood for a short cut through to where I was supposed to be going, but I wasn't supposed to be there, about midnight. And the front axle on the car broke and both tires rolled off. And I had to call my dad at midnight. And he had to know I was where I was not supposed to be. I just got caught. I was never able to run very far. That leash God had me on, he kept pulling me back so I would stay out of trouble. Joseph had probably been placed over his brothers by his father. We mentioned that. The oldest is usually in charge. I was the oldest of the 5 of us. My sister Pam sent me a birthday card just a couple of years ago. And she said, do you remember when we were young and you were always telling me that you were older? Because I had to be in charge when Mom and Dad were gone. She said, this card is to remind you that you're still older than me. I said, oh, thanks, Pam. You know, now that we're in our 60s, let's just poke at each other a little bit. But Joseph was probably jealous to protect the family name. I think he just saw probably clearly black and white, right and wrong. His brothers were doing wrong and he reported on them. But I think he also wanted to protect the family name, because over in Genesis 34, let me read this to you. Genesis 34, verse 30. This is where their sister Dinah had been assaulted. The brothers were angry about that. Jacob was trying to make peace with the men of Shechem who harmed Dinah. But the boys took matters into their own hands. They told them that in order for them to be connected to their family, they would have to be circumcised like the Jews were as a sign. And so when all of the men were not in a good situation, then the brothers went in and had a battle and a half and killed them. And that was not what Jacob had in mind for them to do. And so I'll read where they came upon the city right here in verse 27. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their sheep and their oxen and their asses and that which was in the city and that which was in the field and all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives took they captive and spoiled even all that was in the house. Like, just take it as, you know, from the battle, anything that they wanted. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, ye have troubled me to make me to stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I, being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house. And they said, should he deal with our sister as with an harlot? So the fact that Jacob said, you're going to make my name to stink in the land, and they're going to come after me. I think probably Joseph was trying to protect the family name in reporting his brothers. He didn't want anything else to happen. If they're doing evil, Dad needs to know, is what Joseph probably had in his mind right there. But what were all of these things that we're talking about, was that enough for his brothers to hate him so? Because we know it's coming in the storyline, what all his brothers did to him. But I think that he was just trying to do right and trying to protect the family name. And we're reminded he was probably already salt and light to them, just as we are supposed to be salt and light. And it's convicting how many times we probably never are. It's been on my mind while I've been on this trip. Everywhere I go, I like to leave a track in that city, just so that there is a little bit of light that has been given there. And I think Joseph was probably that light and that salt in his own family. But we'll mention in just a second, and I want to make sure I haven't already overlooked it. I'm reminded that in Revelation, at the end of it, the 12 tribes of Israel are the ones that are on the gates in heaven. And it's interesting that these brothers that we're talking about in this story, along with Joseph, they're the ones that their names are written. They weren't all good. Reuben is on that list, and he's the one that stands out in my mind. I think he may have been the oldest one, maybe. Yes, the oldest one, because at the end of Genesis, that's where Jacob says Reuben is his firstborn, And he said that he's as unstable as water. Thou shalt not excel. Those were Jacob's last words to Reuben. But yet, don't you just see the graciousness and the goodness of God? So much so that these 12 tribes of Israel that God had already determined would be those tribes that he would use, those names that he would use. And even though they weren't perfect, their names are on the gates in heaven. So interesting there. So good. And then Joseph dreamed that he should become the center of family life. That's another thing that probably created part of his problem. I would say all young people dream. Weren't you asked when you were 4 or 5, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, Joseph was a dreamer. What did he say he was going to be? You know, he said, I'm going to rule over you. That's what he said about his brothers. I'll be ruling over you. Joseph's dreams foretold his exaltation. He's going to be exalted, but it also foretold their humiliation, that they would have to serve a younger brother. In Genesis 37, verses 4 and 5, and when his brethren saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. So that tells you the tension that was there. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. So he knew they hated him. And he went ahead and told them their dream, and then they hated him yet the more. He knew what had to be coming his way. He still told them, even though he knew they hated him. And then I think the root of the enmity that they had lay even deeper. Remember in the Garden of Eden, to the serpent, God said, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. So it was always going to be an enmity between right and wrong, good and evil, those kind of things. It's the children of God versus the children of the devil. I'm not saying that the 12 tribes of Israel were children of the devil. I'm just saying that battle was always going to rage, as it is still raging today. Think about this. Joseph's home was one of polygamy and had its problems. Yeah, just even starting right there. But the bottom line is that it was going to be a spiritual battle for the souls of men. In Matthew chapter 10 is where it talks about it will be not peace but a sword, and they have their own households will be the ones who turn against each other. So we just kind of kick off here with the story of Joseph. There's so much more to come. I hope you'll join me each week if you can't be in-house to study with us. But just to apply it, have you ever felt like Joseph felt? Maybe somebody is aiming for you. Take heart. Look at the trampled grass. Others have walked this way. Go on doing right, and nothing terrified by your adversaries. It says in Philippians 1. Be especially careful not to take your case into your own hands. And remember Jesus, who when he was reviled not. Just things that we can learn, just gleaning from how things are playing out here. Joseph was carried through the winds of adversity and saw his dreams fulfilled. Psalms 37:3 says, trust in the Lord and do good, so shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. That's encouragement for all of us. However rough the road is that you may be traveling right now, other people have been down rough roads. Just hang in there. Good endings come a lot of times from those rough roads that we're traveling. And I do thank you for joining me. I hope you'll enjoy this study. I'd encourage you, if you would like, go on Amazon or wherever you can find the book. Sometimes the copies are hard to find, but this book by F.B. Meyer, Joseph, Beloved, Despised, Exalted. And you can just follow along a little bit and get some more of the reading in between, get the additional paragraphs that we might not cover in an outline or something, but it's going to come to life. We still know a lot of stories that are coming, still yet in Joseph's life. And we're going to take those apart and study those together. So thank you for joining me. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Lord, we do thank you so much for the opportunity to read and to study and to fellowship together, Lord, to know you have a plan for our lives, just as surely as you had one for Joseph at this stage of life that we're talking about for him. He didn't know how everything would end, although he had an idea through his dreams that you had given him, and you had big plans for him. And I know you have big plans for us too, Lord, and you're going to spend the ceaseless ages of eternity showing us your kindness. And I pray that will help us to be faithful to you. We love you and thank you for loving us. For it's in Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.